For thousands of years, humanity has wrestled with one single question. It's a question about power. Does true power come from an iron fist or from an open hand? Can you build an empire that lasts on compassion? Or is fear the only tool that truly works? Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me. If you enjoy stories like this, about history's most fascinating figures, please take a moment to subscribe and press that like button. It truly helps more than you know. And I'd love to know when you're listening to this. Are you on a long drive, relaxing at home, or maybe drifting off to sleep? Let me know in the comments below. To understand the answer, you have to travel back in time, way back to the 7th century before the Common Era. Picture a world lit by fire, a world of dust and bronze. The old giants were beginning to stumble. The mighty Assyrian Empire, a name once whispered with terror, was showing cracks in its foundation. In its shadow, other powers were rising. The ambitious Babylonians, the wealthy Lydians, the fierce Medes, they were all circling, hungry, ready to take their piece of the world. This was an age defined by one brutal cycle: conquest, followed by oppression, followed by bloody rebellion. It seemed like the only way the world knew how to work. An endless wheel of violence, where cities were built on the bones of the conquered, and kings ruled from thrones of fear. But far away from the gilded palaces and the blood-soaked battlefields, a different kind of story was beginning. In the rugged highlands of Persia, a boy named Cyrus was growing up. He wasn't raised in a palace. Some legends say he was cast out, left to be raised by animals in the wilderness. His classroom wasn't a marble hall. It was the vast, wind-swept plains. His teachers were the silent mountains, and the ancient stories of justice and fairness whispered around campfires. While other future kings were learning how to command armies, Cyrus was learning to listen. He was learning about the land, about people, and about a different kind of strength, a quiet strength, forged in humility, a vision of leadership that was the exact opposite of the reigns of terror that dominated his world. Because before Cyrus and his vision of an open hand could rise, another king cast a long, chilling shadow over the entire known world. His name was Ashurbanipal. He was the last, and perhaps the greatest, king of Assyria, and his empire was the ultimate testament to the power of the Iron Fist. Ashurbanipal's world was built on one thing: absolute, terrifying power. His armies were machines of conquest. His rule was one of ruthless efficiency and unimaginable cruelty to those who dared to defy him. Where the idea of Cyrus was to unite, Ashurbanipal's goal was to dominate. Where Cyrus would one day offer mercy, Ashurbanipal delivered only brutal, public retribution. His legacy was carved in stone, not with words of kindness, but with images of flayed enemies and pyramids of skulls. This was the world Cyrus was about to enter. This is the story of two men, two kings, two clashing visions for humanity. A story of the crown of compassion versus the scepter of steel. Through the lives of Cyrus the Great and Ashurbanipal, we're going to explore their philosophies of power and see how their choices, their triumphs, and their failures would not only build and destroy empires, but would forever challenge our understanding of what it truly means to lead. And so these two clashing ideas, the open hand and the iron fist, were embodied in two men. For one of them, Cyrus, life began with a death sentence. Before he was even old enough to walk, he was seen as a threat, a prophecy whispered into the ear of his own grandfather, the powerful Median king, Astyages. The king ordered the baby to be left on a mountainside to die. But destiny, or perhaps just simple human kindness, intervened. A shepherd found the child, and unable to leave him to the wolves, raised him as his own. Cyrus's early life was a trial by fire. This period, far from the backstabbing politics of the royal court, became his greatest education. It taught him the value of a hard day's work. It taught him the dignity of common people, people who were loyal not because they were afraid, but because they were respected. He learned the subtle art of leadership that wins hearts, not just battles. When his royal blood was eventually discovered and he was brought back to the Median court, he was a stranger in his own home. He walked the marble halls, surrounded by luxury and paranoia. He watched his grandfather, Astyages, rule through fear and suspicion. He saw how brittle that kind of power was. And Cyrus watched. He learned, but he never forgot the lessons of the mountains. He never abandoned his growing belief that there had to be a better way, a way built on respect and justice. In stark contrast, Ashurbanipal was born into the heart of the machine. He was a prince of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, an empire forged in fire and maintained by an iron grip that spanned the known world. From his first breath, he was groomed for conquest and command. But Ashurbanipal was different from the warrior kings who came before him. He was a scholar, a reader. He was intensely proud of his ability to read and write complex texts, a skill rare even among royalty. He created a library, the first of its kind, a vast collection of all the knowledge of his time. But what did that library contain? It held the histories of his ancestors, which were manuals of brutality. It held omen texts that justified conquest. It held detailed records of tribute, of plunder, and of the horrific punishments inflicted on rebellious cities. This knowledge didn't soften him. It hardened him. It confirmed his worldview. For Ashurbanipal and the Assyrians, cruelty wasn't a flaw in the system. It was the system. Fear was not just a tactic. It was the foundation of civilization, the only thing holding back chaos. It was the air the empire breathed. And so, from these two vastly different beginnings, two future kings emerged. One with a quiet vision of an empire built with its people. The other, the master of an empire built on top of them. They were on a collision course, destined to define an era. But for Cyrus, the path to building his empire, the path to challenging the mighty Ashurbanipal, wouldn't begin on some distant battlefield. It would begin much closer to home. It would begin with an act of defiance, a rebellion against the very king who had tried to have him killed as a baby. The man who was his own grandfather. That defiance would force Cyrus to build an army, but it would be an army unlike the one his grandfather commanded, and certainly nothing like the terror machine of Assyria. The rebellion against his grandfather, Astyages, was the first true test of his philosophy, while Ashurbanipal, on the other side of the world, was sharpening the ultimate weapon of his time. The Assyrian war machine. This wasn't just an army, it was a force of nature, a relentless, disciplined juggernaut that had perfected the art of siege warfare. They could build ramps to scale any wall, dig tunnels to undermine any fortress, and their archers could rain down a sky of death. But their most powerful weapon wasn't made of wood or iron. It was terror, absolute, soul-crushing terror. Ashurbanipal's strategy was simple and brutally effective. When a city defied him, it wasn't just conquered, it was erased. Its people were subjected to unspeakable public tortures designed to be seen and heard by neighboring kingdoms. Kings were flayed alive, their skin hung on city walls. Populations were uprooted and forcibly marched across the empire. A practice of mass deportation that shattered cultural identity and broke the will to resist. The message, carved into stone reliefs for all to see, was simple. Submit completely, or you will not just die. You will be made an example of. Fear was the hammer that crushed all opposition into dust. Cyrus, on the other hand, was forging a different kind of weapon. He was a brilliant general, there's no doubt. His army, a coalition of Persian and Median forces after he defeated his grandfather, was fast, skilled, and loyal. But he knew that a lasting empire, an empire that wouldn't crumble the moment he turned his back, could not be built on fear. His military campaigns were masterpieces of strategy, but they were also masterpieces of psychology. Before his armies even arrived, his spies and diplomats were at work. They didn't spread terror, they spread hope. Two cities crushed under the thumb of tyrants. Cyrus promised liberation. To people whose gods had been mocked and whose temples had been destroyed, he promised religious freedom. To populations exhausted by endless war, he promised peace and justice. His secret weapon wasn't the strength of his spears, but the power of his ideas. He understood a fundamental truth that Ashurbanipal never could. A willing subject is infinitely more valuable than a terrified captive. And so, as these two philosophies were put into practice, the world began to change. Ashurbanipal's reign saw the Assyrian hammer fall on Egypt, crushing rebellions and extending its bloody reach further than ever before. He sacked the great city of Susa in Elam, sowing its fields with salt so nothing would ever grow there again. His empire was at its peak, an invincible titan of terror. At the same time, Cyrus's revolution was beginning. He defeated the ridiculously wealthy King Croesus of Lydia, but instead of executing him, he made him an advisor. He absorbed the Median Empire not by destroying it, but by uniting it with his own. And then he turned his eyes toward the greatest prize of all, the glittering ancient city of Babylon. Conquering it would be his ultimate test. But he wouldn't do it with siege ramps and slaughter. He would do it by turning the people of Babylon themselves against their own king, promising them something they hadn't known for centuries: freedom. The capture of Babylon would be Cyrus's masterpiece. But to understand why it was so revolutionary, you have to first understand the system he was replacing. You have to understand the Assyrian method of control, perfected by Ashurbanipal for him and for the kings before him. Maintaining order was everything, and the method was simple: absolute, state-sponsored terror. The Assyrian Empire didn't just conquer territories. It aimed to systematically break the spirit of resistance, to crush the very idea of rebellion before it could even form. Their royal records, carved into stone for all eternity, don't just boast of victories in battle. They meticulously, almost gleefully, record the chilling details of what happened after the battle. One of their most effective tools was mass deportation. Entire populations, sometimes hundreds of thousands of people, were ripped from their homelands. They were severed from the lands of their ancestors, from their sacred temples, and marched across deserts to the other side of the empire. This wasn't just punishment. It was a cold, calculated strategy. It shattered local identities, broke down loyalties, and turned a unified, rebellious people into a scattered, powerless workforce for the empire's grand construction projects. And if deportation wasn't enough, there was the public spectacle of cruelty. This was Ashurbanipal's signature. His power was broadcast through horrifying public displays. Conquered kings weren't just killed. They were paraded through the streets of the capital, Nineveh, often with hooks or dog chains through their jaws, forced to live in kennels like animals. His own rebellious brother, who had tried to seize the throne of Babylon, was thrown into a furnace. The reliefs from his palace show rows of impaled captives, men being flayed alive while they still screamed, and officials calmly counting piles of severed heads. These weren't hidden acts of war. They were messages, vivid, unforgettable warnings etched into the landscape and burned into the minds of anyone who might dare to think of defying the god Ashur and his king. They practiced cultural destruction on a scale that was meant to be absolute. When Ashurbanipal sacked the city of Susa, the ancient capital of his enemies, the Elamites, he didn't just take its treasure. He bragged about destroying its temples, pouring salt on its fields, and even digging up the bones of its long-dead kings to carry them back to Assyria in chains. It was a final, devastating blow, an attempt to erase a people's history and soul from existence. And beneath all this violence was a relentless economic burden. Conquered lands and vassal states were suffocated by crushing tribute. A constant flow of gold, silver, timber, horses, and even skilled craftsmen was funneled into the Assyrian heartland. This immense wealth built the magnificent palaces and libraries of Nineveh and sustained Ashurbanipal's opulent court. But it bled the rest of the world dry, breeding a deep, simmering resentment that festered just beneath the surface. This was the Assyrian peace, an empire held together by nothing but fear. Every governor, every king, every common farmer understood the price of disobedience. It was brutal, but for a time it was brutally effective. It was a system of total control, but a structure built on such a foundation of pure terror is inherently unstable. It is a tower built on sand, and the tide was about to turn. That turning tide had a name, Cyrus. He offered the world a vision so radical, so completely opposite to the Assyrian way, that it must have sounded like madness to the kings of his time. Where Ashurbanipal built an empire of terror, Cyrus dared to imagine an empire built on cooperation, on respect, on a deep and genuine understanding of the different peoples he brought under his rule. His was a vision of inclusion, something almost completely unheard of in the ancient world. The ultimate proof of this incredible new idea came after he took Babylon. It is forever immortalized in what we now call the Edict of Return. After his army entered the city, famously without a fight because the people opened the gates for him, Cyrus did the unthinkable. He didn't burn the city. He didn't slaughter its priests or enslave its people. Instead, he made a declaration that would echo through history. He announced that all the peoples who had been forcibly deported by the Babylonians and the Assyrians before them were free to go home. Most famously, this included the Jewish people who had been in exile in Babylon for decades. Cyrus not only allowed them to return to Jerusalem, but he gave them funds from the royal treasury to rebuild their sacred temple. Think about that. An emperor, a conqueror, using his own money to rebuild the holy site of a foreign people. This wasn't just generosity. It was brilliant, revolutionary statecraft. By honoring local gods and traditions, Cyrus turned populations of resentful captives into loyal, grateful subjects. He created stability, not through fear, but through goodwill. We have a physical piece of this philosophy. A small, barrel-shaped clay object known as the Cyrus cylinder. On it, in ancient Babylonian cuneiform, Cyrus's policy is spelled out. It talks about returning stolen statues of gods to their rightful temples, of restoring ruined cities, and of allowing deported peoples to return to their homes in peace. It is the polar opposite of the Assyrian policy of cultural destruction and mass deportation. It is a blueprint for a multicultural empire, and this respect went deeper than just religion. Unlike the Assyrians, who tried to crush all local identity and control every aspect of life, Cyrus understood the power of letting people be. He mostly left local kings and governors in place. He allowed people to keep their customs, their laws, and their way of life. He would place a Persian governor, called a satrap, in each province to oversee things, collect a fair tribute, and ensure loyalty. But he didn't try to turn a Babylonian into a Persian. This model of indirect rule was designed for one thing: long-term stability. It gave people a reason to want to be part of his empire. His policies promised something more than just survival under a new master. They promised peace. They promised a chance to rebuild, to trade, to prosper within a vast, protected, and interconnected empire. It was an astonishingly modern idea, but the ancient world was a brutal place, and a question lingered. Could an empire built on such a gentle promise truly survive? Or would the old ways, the ways of the iron fist, prove to be the only thing that could hold power in a world that had only ever known violence? This promise of a better way of life had to be backed up by a system. An empire, no matter how kind its leader, needs an engine to make it run. And the engines built by Ashurbanipal and Cyrus were as different as the men themselves. The Assyrian Empire, for all its horrifying violence, was a marvel of organization. It was a tightly wound clock of centralized control. Ashurbanipal sat at the absolute center of a vast bureaucracy. A complex network of provincial governors, scribes, and officials managed the day-to-day business of the empire. But his most effective tool was his intelligence network. Spies and informants were everywhere, in every provincial court, in every marketplace. There were ears listening for the king. Any whisper of dissent, any hint of rebellion, was reported directly back to the palace in Nineveh. No one could be trusted. Even Ashurbanipal's magnificent library, his personal pride and joy, was a tool of control. Yes, it held ancient epics and scientific knowledge, but it also held thousands upon thousands of administrative letters, reports on crop yields, lists of tribute payments, and detailed accounts of past rebellions and the gruesome punishments that followed. It contained omen texts, which could be interpreted by the priests to give divine justification for any war the king wanted to wage. The library wasn't just a place of learning. It was the central database of the empire, designed to maintain control and predict any threat to the king's power. And if a threat was identified, the response was immediate and overwhelming. There was no negotiation. There was no warning. The Assyrian army would descend, and the retribution would be swift, total, and meticulously recorded for the rest of the world to see. The system sent one constant message: the king sees everything, and no one defies him and gets away with it. Cyrus's system was built on a completely different principle. He knew he couldn't rule a vast, multicultural empire from a single palace, dictating every detail. So he pioneered a system that was both flexible and strong. He formalized the idea of the satrapy. He divided his enormous kingdom into provinces, or satrapies, each managed by a governor, the satrap. But here was the genius of it. These satraps were often local leaders, respected figures from the conquered lands themselves. He gave them a huge amount of autonomy to rule according to their own customs, as long as they paid their tribute and remained loyal to him. This allowed local traditions to flourish under the protection of the Persian Empire. To connect this sprawling, diverse empire, Cyrus laid the foundations for one of the wonders of the ancient world, the Persian Royal Road. It was more than just a road for armies. It was a lifeline for communication and trade, a sophisticated postal system with riders and fresh horses stationed at regular intervals meant that a message could travel from one end of the empire to the other in record time. Information flowed, but so did commerce, ideas, and a sense of being part of something large and prosperous. But Cyrus wasn't naive. He understood that giving governors that much power could be dangerous. So he created a system of checks and balances. He appointed special royal inspectors who were famously known as the king's eyes and the king's ears. These trusted officials traveled unannounced throughout the empire, observing the satraps, listening to the common people, and reporting directly back to Cyrus. They ensured loyalty and prevented corruption. But they did it through oversight, not through an overt network of terrifying spies. And so you have these two completely different structures for running the world. One was a pyramid of fear, with all power concentrated at the top, held in place by brute force. The other was a network, a web of interconnected but semi-independent states, held together by mutual benefit and trust. The great test, of course, would be which one would last, which one could withstand the inevitable pressures of time, rebellion, and human nature. The engine of empire needs a heart, a capital city that projects its power and its philosophy to the world. and the hearts of the Assyrian and Persian empires could not have been more different. Ashurbanipal's capital Nineveh was designed for one purpose: to inspire awe and to terrify. It was a fortress city of colossal scale. Its massive walls, so wide that chariots could race on top of them, stretched for miles, swallowing the landscape. At its gates stood enormous stone guardians, the Lamosophirs, winged bulls with human heads, symbols of divine power and protection. Every brick, every grand palace built within those walls was a monument to the empire's absolute ability to command labor and crush any who opposed it. The most famous part of Nineveh was Ashurbanipal's own palace, and the walls of that palace were not just decorations, they were propaganda carved in stone. The reliefs showed the king as a superhero, a divine warrior. In one scene, he's single-handedly slaying lions in a royal hunt to prove his strength. In the next, and far more common scenes, he is sitting on his throne, calmly watching his soldiers flay his enemies alive, or pile up mountains of severed heads. These images were visual sermons on Assyrian dominance, a permanent broadcast to every visiting ambassador, every vassal king, and every subject of the brutal consequences of defiance. Nineveh was the iron fist made of stone and mud brick. Thousands of miles away, in the Persian highlands, Cyrus was building his capital, Pasargadae, and it offered a completely different vision of what an imperial city could be. It wasn't built to intimidate. It was built to inspire a sense of harmony. The city wasn't squeezed behind menacing walls. Its palaces and audience halls were spread out gracefully across a vast green plain connected by serene, irrigated gardens. These are the first examples we have of the famous Persian paradise gardens, designed to reflect a connection to nature and a more open, less oppressive idea of power. The very architecture of Pasargadae was a quiet statement of Cyrus's philosophy. Unlike the uniform, intimidating style of Assyria, the buildings at Pasargadae subtly blended elements from all the different cultures Cyrus had welcomed into his empire. You could see influences from Ionian Greece, from Babylonia, from Egypt. It was a physical representation of the multicultural world he was trying to build. And perhaps most telling of all was Cyrus's own tomb. It wasn't a grand pyramid or a towering ziggurat. It was a simple, elegant, gabled stone house, standing humbly in the middle of the plain. It speaks of a king who, even in death, saw himself not as a god above his people, but as a man connected to them and to the land itself. And so, the very stones of their capital cities told the stories of their empires. Nineveh was a monument to a kingship built on fear, conquest, and brutal strength. Pasargadae was a testament to a rule that aimed for peace, integration, and a revolutionary balance between power and humanity. Their art and their architecture were their core beliefs, made visible for all the world to see. One screamed power, the other whispered of a new way forward. These two philosophies, the iron fist and the open hand, didn't just shape cities and governments. They shaped the very way people lived and worked. They defined the economic engines of their empires. The economic lifeblood of Ashurbanipal's Assyria was pure, raw extraction. The empire worked like a giant, brutally efficient vacuum cleaner, sucking wealth, resources, and even people from its provinces and vassal states. Conquered lands were bled dry. Punishing tribute demands were placed on every territory. An endless river of silver, gold, precious stones, timber, grain, and horses flowed relentlessly into the capital, Nineveh. But you have to understand, this wasn't trade. This was government-mandated confiscation. The Assyrian economy was addicted to the spoils of war. It ran on the forced labor of millions of deported people who built its canals and palaces, and it was all held together by the constant threat of military violence if tribute wasn't delivered on time and in full. This system made the Assyrian heartland incredibly, fabulously wealthy, but it created a deep, simmering hatred in the provinces. It pushed subjugated peoples to the edge of survival, giving them a powerful reason to rebel the very moment they saw a flicker of weakness. Cyrus, on the other hand, understood that you can only bleed a subject dry for so long before they die. He knew that pure extraction wasn't sustainable, so he started to build a different kind of economic model, one based on integration. Yes, tribute was still collected. The Persian Empire needed resources to run, but the system was designed to be more predictable, more fair, and to foster local economies instead of crushing them. The promise of peace and protection under the massive Persian shield encouraged farmers to plant crops and merchants to travel and trade. By respecting local customs and, most importantly, by allowing deported peoples to return to their homes, Cyrus was making a savvy economic investment. He was encouraging economic recovery and productivity in the provinces. When he started building his famous road networks, it wasn't just for moving armies or messengers quickly. It was creating the essential infrastructure for trade. For the first time, goods and ideas could flow freely and safely across vast distances, connecting Lydia to Babylon and Egypt to Persia. This approach gave people a reason to cooperate. The provinces and vassal states contributed to the empire, not just because they were afraid of what would happen if they didn't, but because they could see real benefits. They got protection from raiders and rival kingdoms. They got access to huge new markets for their goods. They got a stable and predictable environment where they could rebuild, grow, and even prosper. So you have two empires with two completely different economic philosophies. One built its wealth on the systematic impoverishment of its subjects, creating a glittering but fragile prosperity that was destined to collapse. The other tried to create a shared prosperity, recognizing that a healthy or thriving province ultimately makes the entire empire stronger. These economic choices, the choice between extraction and integration, would be just as important as their armies in deciding their ultimate fates. Ultimately, the greatest difference between these two empires came down to a simple question: what do you do with the people you conquer? Their answers to this question would define their legacies. For Ashurbanipal and the Assyrians, conquered people were like raw clay, to be forcefully remolded into the shape of an Assyrian subject. The policy was simple: break their spirit, dismantle their culture, and cut them off from their heritage. The mass deportations weren't just about moving a workforce around. They were a deliberate tool of cultural warfare. By scattering populations across the empire, they disoriented people, stripped them of their collective memory, and destroyed their national unity. Local languages were suppressed. Traditional leaders, the kings and elders who held a community together, were executed or humiliated. And most importantly, their gods were attacked. Sacred statues were stolen and carried off to Nineveh as trophies, or simply smashed to pieces. The goal was to erase any foundation for an independent identity that could one day fuel a rebellion. They wanted to turn a vibrant mosaic of different peoples into a dull uniform and obedient gray mass. It was assimilation by force, a brutal and systematic erasure of culture. Cyrus, on the other hand, looked at the mosaic of different cultures in his path and saw not a threat but a source of strength. He championed a policy of what we would now call cultural pluralism. He understood that an empire built on respecting different identities could be far stronger and more stable than one built on forced uniformity. His famous Edict of Return, allowing the Jews to go home and rebuild their temple, was the ultimate symbol of this. But the philosophy went much deeper. He allowed conquered peoples to keep their traditions, to worship their own gods, and to speak their own languages. And this wasn't just passive tolerance, like turning a blind eye. It was active endorsement. He would participate in local religious ceremonies. He would take titles from the local kings he had conquered, like King of Babylon, showing respect for their history. By embracing the diverse tapestry of his subjects, he turned potential hotbeds of rebellion into pillars of support. He made them feel like valued members of a larger community, not like an oppressed minority crushed under a foreign boot. This policy created an astonishing level of loyalty among many of his subjects, even among people who had originally fought against his armies. The long-term consequences of these two opposite policies could not be more stark. The Assyrian approach, the policy of cultural annihilation, created a deep, burning resentment that festered for generations. When the chance for revenge finally came, their enemies showed them no mercy. Cyrus's approach of integration, however, laid the foundation for a multi-ethnic empire that would not only survive, but would become a crossroads of culture and ideas for centuries. The choices these two kings made to either destroy or to preserve the identities of the people they ruled would echo far beyond their own lifetimes, and they still resonate in our world today whenever we talk about how different peoples can live together. But being a king, whether you rule with an iron fist or an open hand, is a heavy burden. Power itself creates its own challenges, its own pressures that can crack even the strongest foundations. Even at the absolute peak of his power, Ashurbanipal was a king living in a state of constant siege. The very terror that he used to build his empire also guaranteed that he would never know a moment of true peace. Every province, every vassal state was a coiled spring of hatred, just waiting for the pressure to ease for a single moment. And the most devastating proof of this came from within his own family. He had installed his own brother, Shamash, as the king of Babylon, thinking he could trust him. But his brother, living among a proud people who despised their Assyrian overlords, eventually turned against him. He led a massive, widespread rebellion that ignited a fire across the empire. Other subjugated kingdoms, smelling blood in the water, joined in. This wasn't just a political squabble. It was a violent, desperate explosion of all the suppressed rage and humiliation that Assyrian rule had created. It was proof that an empire built only on fear will always, eventually, rot from within. Ashurbanipal, with his superior army, crushed the rebellion. The retribution was, as always, horrific. He burned his own brother alive, but the victory was a hollow one. The long, bloody civil war exhausted Assyria. It drained its treasury, it bled its armies, and it broke its spirit. The great hammer was beginning to crack. Cyrus faced a different kind of burden. His challenges weren't about stamping out constant, violent rebellions. His challenge was the immense, quiet weight of maintaining his revolutionary vision. The task of truly integrating dozens of different cultures, languages, and religions into a single functioning empire was something no one had ever attempted on this scale before. It was a monumental undertaking. While his policies of tolerance and respect created widespread loyalty, the sheer size and diversity of his empire required constant attention and incredibly wise management. Think of it like trying to conduct a massive orchestra where every musician is playing a different instrument from a different musical tradition. To make it create harmony instead of noise requires a leader of incredible skill and patience. The very idea of a multicultural, respectful empire was a fragile experiment. It was a delicate plant growing in the hard, rocky soil of a world that was used to nothing but conquest and oppression. It needed constant care to keep it from withering. And for both of these mighty kings, as they grew older, the ultimate test of their life's work loomed on the horizon. Succession. Who would come after them? Who would inherit the crown? And more importantly, who would inherit their philosophy of rule? For Ashurbanipal, whose empire was held together by his personal strength and terror, the thought of succession must have been terrifying. For Cyrus, whose empire was built on a delicate vision of tolerance, it was both a profound hope and a monumental challenge. The future of the world they had built depended entirely on the sons who would follow them. That question of succession, of what comes next, would be answered in the most dramatic way possible for the Assyrian Empire. Ashurbanipal's mighty reign, for all of its terrifying power, had been the final, brilliant flash before the darkness. The constant warfare, the endless campaigns to put down rebellions, and most of all, the deep, burning hatred he had cultivated in every corner of his empire, had hollowed it out from the inside. There were simply too many enemies, too many people with a score to settle, waiting for their chance. And when that chance came, the collapse was stunningly fast. After Ashurbanipal's death, a series of weak and squabbling kings couldn't hold the crumbling empire together. It was like a dam breaking, a tidal wave of combined forces, the Babylonians from the south, the Medes from the east, and fierce Scythian horsemen from the north, all of them united by one thing, a shared desire for revenge against Assyria crashed down upon them. In the year 612 BCE, the unthinkable happened. Nineveh, the great, impenetrable fortress city, the heart of terror, was besieged, captured, and utterly destroyed. They didn't just conquer it, they annihilated it. They tore down its walls, burned its palaces, and so thoroughly wiped it from the face of the earth that for 2,000 years people thought it was just a myth. The very policies of absolute terror and cultural destruction that had built the Assyrian Empire led directly to its complete and total eradication from history. The hammer of the world was broken, and the world rejoiced. Cyrus's end was completely different. He did not live to see his empire collapse in flames. Instead, he died as he had lived, a king on the move, a warrior in command. In his later years, he pushed his campaigns into the far eastern steppes, into the wild lands beyond the known maps. There, he came up against a fierce nomadic people, the Massagetæ, led by their warrior queen, Tamiris. Cyrus, the master strategist, the conqueror of Babylon and Lydia, finally met his match. He died in battle, a warrior to the very last. The details are shrouded in legend, but what is certain is that his death was not the result of a bitter internal rebellion. His empire did not crumble under the weight of its own cruelty. Instead, his death marked the end of a single remarkable life. And he left behind an empire that, unlike Assyria, was strong, stable, and unified. An empire that would not only endure his death, but would continue to grow and flourish for another 200 years, precisely because of the strong, flexible foundations of tolerance and respect that he had so carefully laid. And so, the end of their reigns were as different as their beginnings. One empire vanished from the earth, leaving behind a legacy of fear, destruction, and a lesson in how not to rule. The other, though it lost its visionary founder, continued on its unprecedented journey. This stark contrast would forever shape how history remembered these two titans, these two opposite faces of power. How does history judge a king? Is it by the size of their empire, or by the nature of their rule? The final verdict on Ashurbanipal and Cyrus is perhaps the most telling part of their story. After the fall of Nineveh, Ashurbanipal and the entire Assyrian Empire were remembered in the ancient world as a nightmare that had finally ended. In the historical records of the Babylonians, the Egyptians, and especially in the Hebrew Bible, their very name became a synonym for cruelty and oppression. They were the ultimate villains, a terrifying but ultimately defeated force of destruction. And then they were forgotten. Their great cities, buried under mounds of earth, were lost for over 2,000 years. Nineveh became just a name in old books, a mythical place of sin and hubris. It was only in the 19th century that modern archaeologists, digging in the sands of what is now Iraq, rediscovered the ruins of those palaces. And as they uncovered the stone reliefs with their graphic depictions of torture and conquest, they confirmed that the ancient stories of Assyrian brutality were not exaggerations, they were fact. Cyrus, on the other hand, entered the pages of history as a figure of almost universal admiration. His legacy was not just preserved, it was celebrated by vastly different cultures, even by his enemies. For the Persians, for the Jewish people, his legacy was even more profound. He is the only non-Jew in the Hebrew Bible to be called a Messiah or Anointed One. The prophet Isaiah speaks of him as an instrument of God's will. This is a level of praise for a foreign conqueror that is completely unparalleled in all of ancient history. And, perhaps most surprisingly, even the Greeks, who would later become the great rivals of the Persian Empire, looked back on Cyrus with immense respect. The famous Greek soldier and philosopher Xenophon wrote a book called the Repedia, which is basically a biography of Cyrus, In it, he portrays Cyrus as the perfect, ideal ruler, a model of enlightened leadership, virtue, and statesmanship. This was the complete opposite of how the Greeks usually portrayed foreign kings, whom they called despots and tyrants. They saw Cyrus as a king who combined incredible strength with mercy and great ambition with personal integrity. And so, the way these two kings were remembered tells us everything. One became a cautionary tale, a memory of terror that was so hated it was almost completely erased by the very people he oppressed. The other became a legend, a beacon of enlightened rule, whose principles of justice and tolerance were so powerful that they echoed across cultures and through thousands of years of history, shaping the very idea of what a great leader could be. History, it seems, has a long memory, and it remembers not just what you built, but how you built it. The stories of Ashurbanipal and Cyrus didn't end with their deaths. Their choices sent ripples through time, and the immediate aftermath of their reigns set the world on two completely different paths. The sudden and total destruction of the Assyrian Empire left a gaping hole in the middle of the ancient world. The very brutality that had held their enormous territory together for so long became the fuel for its downfall. It united its countless enemies in a single, shared purpose to ensure that Assyria would not just be defeated, but that it would be wiped off the map forever. And in the chaos that followed, there was a frantic scramble for power. The very peoples who had been crushed under the Assyrian boot rose up to take its place. The Medes, who had helped destroy Nineveh, carved out a powerful kingdom for themselves. And in the south, the Babylonians, now free from their overlords, created a new, glorious empire of their own. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, which would become the new dominant force in the region, at least for a little while. The immediate legacy of Assyria, therefore, was a negative one. It was a cautionary tale, a lesson written in blood and fire about the dangers of ruling through pure tyranny, and a terrifying example of the destructive power of collective revenge. The passing of Cyrus the Great had the opposite effect. It did not trigger a collapse. It did not create a power vacuum. Instead, his successors inherited a strong, stable, and surprisingly loyal empire. They had challenges, of course. His son, Cambyses, had to prove himself, and he did so by continuing the expansion of the empire, successfully conquering the ancient and wealthy kingdom of Egypt. This proved that the Persian military and administrative machine was not dependent on one man, but it was under Cyrus's next major successor, Darius the Great, that the true genius of Cyrus's vision was fully realized. Darius took the foundations that Cyrus had laid and built a skyscraper on top of them. He perfected the satrapy system of provincial government. He expanded the royal road into a marvel of ancient engineering. He created a standardized system of weights, measures, and a single currency the derrick which made trade across the vast empire easier than ever before. And most importantly, he continued Cyrus's core policy of respecting local customs and religions. He was building on a foundation of trust and integration, not fear. This created an empire that, unlike Assyria, had a deep, resilient core that could withstand shocks and endure for centuries. So the short-term echoes of these two kings couldn't be clearer. One empire's brutal end wiped the slate clean and allowed new powers to rise from its ashes. The other empire's stable continuation proved that a different way of building and holding power was not just a naive dream, but a remarkably effective and sustainable reality. The choices they made directly shaped the next chapter in the story of civilization. So when we strip everything else away, what are we left with? We are left with two men, two kings, who represent two timeless, competing philosophies of power. It's a debate about the ends versus the means. Ashurbanipal's entire reign was a living, breathing example of the belief that power is its own justification, that the end goal in his case, maintaining the absolute, unquestioned dominance of the Assyrian Empire, justified any means necessary to achieve it. For the Assyrians, this was almost a religious belief. Their chief god, Ashur, had commanded them to rule the world. Therefore, any action taken in the name of that god, no matter how brutal, was not just acceptable, it was righteous. This philosophy sees the world as a dark and chaotic place. It believes that human nature is inherently rebellious and must be controlled with overwhelming force. In this worldview, a king's primary duty is to be the hammer that crushes all opposition without hesitation and without mercy. Compassion is seen as a fatal weakness. Tolerance is seen as an invitation for chaos and rebellion. Power is, and can only ever be, an act of coercion. Sadly, the lessons of this dark philosophy would not die with the Assyrian Empire. They would be studied and copied by tyrants for thousands of years to come. Cyrus, on the other hand, stands as a powerful counterargument to this entire way of thinking. His life and his rule suggest a completely different idea, that power exercised with justice, with wisdom, and with compassion can be more effective and far more lasting than power exercised through terror. His actions seem to show a deep belief that the way you get and hold power the means is just as important as the power itself. For Cyrus, justice, tolerance, and respect for other cultures were not just clever tricks to keep people from rebelling. They appear to have been genuine principles. His vision proved to the world that it was possible for a king to be both incredibly powerful and also benevolent. It showed that you could be a conqueror and at the same time be seen as a liberator. This was such a radical idea, so completely different from the way the world had worked for centuries, that it offered a glimpse of a totally new and more humane way to build an empire. And so, their lives pose a question that leaders have wrestled with ever since. Is it better to be feared or to be loved? Does might make right, or is there a higher moral standard that a ruler must answer to? Ashurbanipal's legacy is a stark, chilling reminder of the destructive nature of unchecked power. Cyrus's legacy is a hopeful testament to the enduring strength of enlightened and humane leadership. This fundamental question about the nature of power, its purpose, and its limits is the true heart of their story. And it's a question that we are still trying to answer today. That timeless question of fear versus respect isn't just a story from the ancient past. The lives of Ashurbanipal and Cyrus offer sobering lessons that are just as relevant today on our world stage as they were on theirs. The story of Ashurbanipal and the collapse of the Assyrian Empire is a powerful warning. It shows us that any system of power, no matter how strong it looks, if it is built only on fear and brutal suppression, is fragile. It is unsustainable. History shows us, again and again, that even the most powerful tyrannies eventually crumble under the weight of their own cruelty. By trying to stamp out every spark of rebellion, they create a firestorm of hatred that, one day, will consume them. The fall of Assyria is a stark reminder that while force can conquer territory, it can never truly unite people. It creates enemies, not allies. The peace it creates is just the silence of the oppressed, a silence that is waiting patiently for the right moment to erupt into violence. Leaders and nations who choose that path, the path of the iron fist, inevitably sow the seeds of their own destruction. Cyrus the Great's legacy, on the other hand, continues to inspire us for a reason. His revolutionary ideas about how to run an empire, ideas founded on respect for human dignity, for cultural diversity, and for religious freedom, are the very same ideas that we now consider to be the cornerstones of good government and healthy international relations. From the modern concept of human rights to the importance of diplomacy and cultural exchange over threats and intimidation, Cyrus's ancient strategies echo powerfully in our world. His example reminds us that true, lasting strength is not found in the size of your army or your capacity for violence. It is found in the ability to build bridges, to foster trust, and to unite different kinds of people through shared values and a shared purpose, not by forcing them into submission. The ancient sands of Mesopotamia bore witness to this fundamental clash of ideals, embodied by these two extraordinary kings. Their stories, though separated from us by thousands of years, continue to teach us about the choice we still face every day. Do we seek to build through coercion and fear, or through understanding and cooperation? The choice between the crown of compassion and the scepter of steel remains the defining challenge of leadership. But what happens when the man who inherits the crown of compassion seems to have a taste for the scepter of steel? Cyrus's son and successor, Cambyses, marched his father's armies into Egypt, the last great kingdom yet to be conquered, and the rumors that began to filter back from the banks of the Nile were deeply disturbing. They were tales of a sacred bull slain in a fit of rage, of paranoia and cruelty that sounded less like the wisdom of Cyrus and more like the echoes of an Assyrian ghost. Was the father's vision of a tolerant world so fragile that it could be shattered by his own son? That question of whether the son could so easily shatter the father's dream forces us to look deeper, to look past the policies and the armies and into the very character of the men who sat on these ancient thrones. Beneath the hardened shell of the ruthless conqueror, Ashurbanipal was a deeply complex man. He wasn't just a mindless warrior king. He was a scholar, a patron of learning, a man who was genuinely fascinated by the vast intellectual history of Mesopotamia. His library, that incredible collection of knowledge, was the passion project of a king who truly valued wisdom, who wanted to gather and preserve everything the world had ever written. But this intellectual curiosity existed right alongside a terrifying, absolute conviction in Assyrian superiority, and a chilling readiness to inflict any suffering necessary to prove it. His personality was the Assyrian state in human form, meticulously organized, incredibly efficient, and completely, utterly devoid of compassion for anyone who stood outside its divine mission. He believed in order above all else. He was convinced that it was his sacred duty to enforce that order with an iron will, and his divine right to punish anyone who questioned it. Cyrus the Great seems to have been a completely different kind of person. The stories about him, from both his own people and from foreigners, paint a picture of a leader who managed to combine immense military skill with a powerful sense of justice and empathy. That unusual childhood, spent far from the poison and paranoia of the royal court, seems to have given him a unique ability to actually listen to people, to connect with them and understand them. He was a visionary, not just because he conquered a huge empire, but because he had a profound understanding of human psychology. He knew that loyalty won through respect is 100 times stronger than obedience demanded by fear. His ability to adapt his strategies, to forgive his enemies, and to integrate different cultures into his empire made him a true anomaly in an age that was defined by vengeance and destruction. He was, in essence, a king who dared to lead with his heart as well as with his sword. Their personal beliefs, their temperaments, their very characters were not just footnotes to their history. They were the foundation of everything they built. The great clash between the Persian and Assyrian empires was, in many ways, the clash of two profoundly different men, each one embodying a completely different idea of what it means to wear the crown. And when the great King Cyrus finally fell in battle on the distant eastern frontier, the weight of his character, the weight of his legend, settled upon the empire. Imagine the scene, the solemn procession carrying the body of the father of the nation back to his simple, elegant tomb at Pasargadae. As they laid him to rest, a new reality dawned. The visionary was gone, and now his son, Cambyses, a man of a very different character, would have to step out of that colossal shadow and try to rule the world his father had built. Could any man live up to such a legacy? Could any man live up to such a legacy? This is the question that looms over all great figures in history. But history is not just about the great figures. Behind the stone reliefs of kings and the grand stories of conquest are the lives of millions of ordinary people, and their stories are just as important. For those living under the Assyrian boot, life was hard. It was an existence defined by back-breaking work to pay the heavy tribute, by the constant threat of being drafted into forced labor gangs, and by the chilling, ever-present fear of the Assyrian army appearing on the horizon. Their stories are not written down in the king's grand history books, but you can hear their echoes in the archaeological record. You can see them in the layers of ash that mark a destroyed city, and in the abandoned farmlands of a people who were forcibly deported to the other side of the world. The magnificent Assyrian Empire was built on the backs of these people. Their lives were a silent, grueling struggle against a force that demanded everything from them, and in return gave them nothing but fear. They are the true, forgotten victims of what Ashurbanipal would have called the Assyrian peace in the sprawling Persian Empire that Cyrus built. The story of the common person began to change. For many, his reign and the reigns of the kings who followed his principles brought a profound sense of relief. After centuries of brutal warfare and oppression, they were finally given a measure of stability. Communities that had been shattered were now free to rebuild their homes, their temples, and their economies. The incredible diversity of the Persian Empire created a vibrant exchange of ideas, of technologies, and of goods. A potter in Judea could sell his wares in a market in Babylon. A Greek doctor could find work in the Persian court. Local customs and languages were respected. People could, for the most part, live their lives according to their own traditions, contributing to the wealth of the empire not as terrified slaves, but as subjects of a vast, multicultural state. It wasn't a perfect utopia, of course, but it offered a level of security, opportunity, and simple human dignity that was revolutionary for its time. And so, these two empires offered two completely different futures for the common person. One legacy was defined by suppression, suffering, and the erasure of identity. The other was defined by opportunity, stability, and the quiet dignity of being allowed to be who you are. The stories of these millions of unnamed people, their fears and their hopes, are perhaps the most powerful testament of all to the difference between the scepter of steel and the crown of compassion. The stories of these two empires force us to ask a fundamental question. What makes an empire, or any system of power, truly last? The Assyrian Empire, under its last great king, Ashurbanipal, seemed like it would last forever. It looked indestructible. Its armies were unmatched. Its control over its subjects was absolute. And yet, its sudden and catastrophic collapse is one of history's most powerful and chilling lessons. Empires that are built only on fear, on crushing the human spirit, are brittle. They are fundamentally unstable. The very force that makes them seem so strong is the same force that guarantees their destruction. It breeds a deep, burning resentment that, sooner or later, will tear them apart from the inside. Empires like Assyria are like a magnificent palace built on shifting sand. They look solid, they look impressive, but they have no real foundation. And when they fall hard and fast, leaving behind nothing but a legacy of pain and an empty space on the world map for new powers to fight over. The Persian Empire, founded by Cyrus, stands in stark contrast. It lasted for over 200 years, a very long time in the ancient world, and its longevity was not an accident. It was the direct result of the foundational principles that Cyrus had put in place. Tolerance for different cultures and religions, a flexible and decentralized government, and the integration of different peoples by giving them a real stake in the success of the empire. This model proved to the world that an empire could be both vast and powerful, but also resilient, without having to rule through constant terror. It showed that creating a shared purpose and allowing people cultural freedom could be a stronger glue than fear. It could build a stability that would outlast its founder and generations of kings who followed. And the lessons from this ancient rivalry go far beyond just empires. They offer timeless insights into the nature of power itself, whether it's the power of a king, a government, a CEO, or even the power dynamics within a family. How is that power being used? Is it being built on a foundation of fear and coercion, or on a foundation of respect and mutual understanding? The answers to these ancient questions, posed by the lives of Cyrus and Ashurbanipal, are just as vital for us today as they were thousands of years ago. We are all, in our own small ways, still choosing between these two paths. Through the incredible, epic stories of Ashurbanipal and Cyrus the Great, history gives us a clear and powerful choice. It presents us with two opposite paths. On one side, we have the relentless, brutal pursuit of power through terror. This is the path of the Assyrian king, whose every victory was carved in stone with the images of his enemies' suffering. On the other side, we have the bold, revolutionary vision of an empire built on respect and integration. This is the path of the Persian unifier, who understood that true power came from winning hearts, not just from winning battles. Their reigns, though they happened so close to each other in time, give us a stark, almost perfect comparison of how power, when used in these two completely different ways, shapes the course of human history. Ashurbanipal's mighty empire, for all its terrifying strength, collapsed almost overnight, and it left behind a legacy of hatred and destruction. It is the ultimate proof that any system built only on coercion is fundamentally weak. Fear, it turns out, is a powerful weapon to conquer people, but it is a terrible foundation on which to build anything that lasts. It can create obedience, but it can never create true loyalty or cooperation. Cyrus's empire, by contrast, lasted for centuries, not because it was weak or soft, but because it was built on a revolutionary understanding of human nature. Cyrus knew that people are more willing to contribute, more willing to obey the law, and more willing to be loyal when their basic human dignity is respected, when their cultures are honored, and when their beliefs are tolerated. His story reveals a fundamental truth that is so often overlooked, that trust, even in the brutal world of ancient empires, creates a deeper, stronger, and more resilient power than terror ever could. And these are not just stories about ancient kings with strange names. They are timeless lessons about leadership itself. Whether you are running a country, leading a community, building a business, or even just raising a family, the choices between domination and cooperation, between ruling through fear or leading with respect, are always present. History, through the lives of these two titans, holds up a mirror to our own time and to our own choices. It reminds us that the way we choose to use power, whatever power we may have, is what will ultimately define the legacy we leave behind. So we are left with a final, personal question. What kind of legacy are we building? What lessons will we choose to carry forward into our own lives from the ancient, echoing voices of the crown of compassion and the scepter of steel? The story of Cyrus the Great and Ashurbanipal, therefore, is not a closed book. It is not some dusty relic of the past. It is a living, breathing conversation that continues to happen every day in the choices that we make, in the leaders that we decide to follow, and in the kind of societies that we try to build. Their two opposite paths are a constant reminder that the biggest questions about power, how you get it, how you use it, and what its ultimate purpose is, are never truly settled. History doesn't just tell us what happened. It invites us to ask why it happened and what lessons we can still learn from it today. From the ancient scribes who first wrote down their deeds, to the modern scholars who carefully pieced together the fragments of their world, the narrative of these two kings has been shaped, interpreted, and passed down through countless generations. The enduring power of Cyrus's legend, which is often cleaned up and polished to make him seem perfect, and the stark, terrifying warning of Ashurbanipal's reign. They remind us of the immense importance of the stories we choose to tell about power. It challenges us to look past the battlefield victories and the lists of conquered cities, and to search for the true sources of lasting influence and stability. And so, as we close this long chapter on two of history's most fascinating and contrasting leaders, I hope you will continue your own journey of exploration, to ask more questions, to compare their stories to others, and to draw your own conclusions from the rich and complex story of our past. Because by understanding the triumphs and the failures of those who came before us, we gain priceless insight into the challenges and the opportunities that lie ahead for us all. The ancient dust of Mesopotamia and Persia holds the echoes of two kings, two philosophies, two destinies. One built a monument to fear that crumbled into ash. The other laid the foundation for an empire of ideas that would resonate through millennia. In their clashing legacies, we find a timeless truth that the true measure of a ruler, and indeed of any power, lies not just in how much they conquer, but in how much they inspire, how much they preserve, and how profoundly they choose to shape the future, with compassion or with steel. The choice, as always, remains ours. Thank you so much for joining me on this incredible journey through the ancient world. If you've enjoyed this story and found it valuable, I would be so grateful if you would like this video and subscribe to the channel. It makes a huge difference. Please let me know in the comments what you thought, and perhaps who you would like to hear about next. Should we follow the story of Persia under Darius the Great? Or maybe jump forward to see its epic clash with Alexander? Your suggestions truly help shape the future of this channel. Thank you again for your time and for your attention. Until next time, take care.